How does a quiet boy from Ohio become one of the most infamous names in American criminal history? Not through rage, not through revenge, but through something much more silent and much more unsettling. Jeffrey Dahmer was not the kind of criminal that storms into the public eye with chaos and fury. He was by all accounts unremarkable, almost invisible. A shy child, a soft-spoken teenager, a man who could blend into the crowd without raising a single eyebrow. And yet beneath the surface something was unraveling. This video is not about the crimes, it's about the mind behind them. We're not here to glorify or excuse, we're here to understand. Because sometimes the most disturbing stories don't begin with blood or violence. They begin with silence, with loneliness, with a slow collapse of empathy and identity. Today we'll explore the psychological evolution of Jeffrey Dahmer, not through gruesome headlines, but through emotional milestones, childhood traumas, internal disconnections, missed red flags. What happens when emotional needs go unheard for too long? What does it look like when someone's identity quietly erodes from within? Let's take a thoughtful journey not into what Jeffrey Dahmer did, but into how a human mind broke down, piece by piece. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer committed a series of murders that shocked the nation. His crimes took place primarily in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they followed a disturbing pattern targeting young men, often luring them under false pretenses. The total number of victims reached 17. But this video will not describe those acts. We won't repeat the headlines, we won't relive the details. What matters here is the pattern of behavior, the progression of psychological decline. Dahmer didn't start out violent. His actions developed slowly, over years. What began as private fantasies grew darker. And eventually, those fantasies turned into reality. He was arrested in July of 1991 when a potential victim managed to escape and alert the police. Inside Dahmer's apartment, authorities discovered overwhelming evidence. He confessed to everything, calmly, even cooperatively. To many, the crimes were unthinkable. But to understand them, we must go beyond shock. We must understand the mind that unraveled behind closed doors. Because what Jeffrey Dahmer did, though horrific, is not just a story of evil. It's a story of emotional erosion, of warning signs ignored, and of a person who quietly lost all connection to others and to himself. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first child of Joyce and Lionel Dahmer, a middle-class couple navigating the challenges of early parenthood. From the outside, their life looked ordinary. They lived in quiet neighborhoods. They took family photos. They hosted birthdays. Jeffrey was described by neighbors and teachers as shy, polite, even well-mannered. He loved animals. He enjoyed collecting rocks. He seemed in many ways like any other boy. But behind that quiet exterior, something was shifting. At school, he struggled to make friends. He was often withdrawn. He rarely smiled. He didn't cause trouble, but he didn't connect either. His father, Lionel, was a chemist, focused, logical, often absent due to work. His mother, Joyce, battled mental health challenges and frequent anxiety. Their marriage was turbulent, marked by shouting matches and long silences. As Jeffrey grew older, the family moved several times. Each move seemed to pull him further into isolation. He learned to mask his feelings, to hide his confusion, to disappear, even when he was in the room. And slowly, without anyone noticing, Jeffrey Dahmer began to emotionally disconnect from the world around him. To understand Jeffrey Dahmer's mind, we have to begin at the root, his childhood. From a young age, Jeffrey showed signs of emotional detachment. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't loud, but he was distant. His teachers noticed it, so did his parents. But no one knew exactly what to make of it. His home life was filled with tension. His parents' arguments were frequent and intense. His mother, Joyce, suffered from depression and bouts of irrational behavior. She often took prescription medication. His father, though present, was focused on work and struggled to connect emotionally. In that environment, Jeffrey withdrew further. He learned early that emotions were either explosive or ignored. So he chose silence. As a child, he developed a fascination with dead animals. At first, it seemed like scientific curiosity, something he picked up from his father, a chemist who once showed him how to bleach animal bones. But over time, it became something darker. He began collecting roadkill. He would dissect small creatures in the woods behind their house. No one intervened. To many, he was just a weird kid. Quiet, peculiar, but not dangerous. Psychologists later suggested these behaviors may have been early signs of detachment disorder or antisocial tendencies. But at the time, they were brushed off as a phase. There was no clinical diagnosis, no therapy, no real conversations about what he was feeling inside. And so those early warning signs remained hidden behind a quiet face and an increasingly fractured mind. By the time Jeffrey Dahmer entered his teenage years, the emotional distance had deepened. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours. His classmates noticed, teachers noticed. But again, no one intervened. It was easier to ignore than to ask why a 14-year-old needed alcohol just to get through the day. At home, things continued to spiral. His parents' marriage grew more volatile. The house once tense became chaotic. Eventually, when Jeffrey was 18, they divorced. His mother moved out, taking his younger brother. His father moved out too. For a period of time, Jeffrey lived alone in the family house, unsupervised, unseen, unmoored. It was during this time that the first known crime occurred. But again, this video is not about the act. It's about what came before. This period marked a significant psychological shift. Jeffrey wasn't just isolated. He was emotionally abandoned. There were no support systems, no guidance, no boundaries. He struggled with his identity, especially his sexuality, which he kept hidden. He feared rejection. He feared exposure. And so, he buried every feeling. He described his inner world as dead, numb, disassociated, detached from reality. Psychologists believe this emotional flatness combined with a deep fear of abandonment may have contributed to his need for complete control. Not out of hatred, but out of desperation to hold on to something, anything that wouldn't leave him. This was the beginning of the unraveling. Not a sudden explosion, but a slow, quiet collapse. It didn't happen all at once. There was no loud moment, no public outburst. Just silence. Jeffrey Dahmer's breakdown wasn't visible on the outside. It was quiet, private, invisible. He later described it as a feeling of total emptiness. He would sit for hours, still silent, expressionless. He didn't reach out. He didn't cry. He simply shut down. There was one moment, one image that stands out. He described standing in front of a mirror, looking into his own eyes, and feeling nothing. No connection, no humanity, just a hollow shell. He wasn't angry, he wasn't sad, he was simply gone. That moment wasn't about violence, it wasn't about control, it was about disconnection. Psychologists call this a form of emotional dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism, where the mind disconnects from feelings that are too painful to process. It's often linked to trauma, to neglect, and to long-term emotional deprivation. In that mirror, Jeffrey wasn't seeing a person. He was seeing the absence of one. And that absence, that emotional void, would become the space where dangerous fantasies began to take root. Not because he wanted to hurt, but because he didn't know how to feel. This was the emotional collapse. The point of no return. Not marked by rage, but by a complete loss of self. Before the crimes, there were thoughts, dark thoughts, persistent thoughts, but they didn't arrive with sirens or screams. They arrived quietly, like shadows sliding across the floor. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't act impulsively. He fantasized deeply, repetitively, obsessively. He imagined scenarios where people would never leave, where they would stay with him forever. Still, silent, unresisting. He didn't think of it as cruelty. To him, it was control. And in his world, control meant safety. He rationalized these fantasies, told himself they were harmless, that as long as they stayed in his mind, no one would get hurt. But the fantasies didn't stay put. They grew stronger, more detailed, more real. Psychologists refer to this as cognitive distortion, a pattern where the mind reshapes reality to fit unhealthy beliefs. In Jeffrey's case, he wasn't planning crimes. He was building a world inside his head, one where he wasn't abandoned, one where he was never alone. His empathy, already fragile, began to disappear. He stopped seeing people as individuals with lives, emotions, and stories. He saw them as part of a need, a solution to the emptiness. This emotional numbing combined with repeated rejection created a dangerous mental landscape, one where fantasy began to feel more real than reality, and where the difference between thought and action started to blur. He didn't want to become a criminal. He just didn't know how to stop becoming one. After the first crime, Jeffrey Dahmer didn't run. He didn't cry. He didn't confess. He cleaned up. He went on with his day. He acted normal. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But on the inside, something had shifted. Instead of fear, he felt relief. Instead of guilt, he felt calm. He later described it as a strange kind of peace. Not joy, not excitement, just quiet. This reaction, this flat, emotionless state, is known in psychology as emotional blunting. It's when the brain suppresses emotional response to cope with stress or trauma. But in Dahmer's case, it was something deeper. A sign that empathy had been replaced with detachment. As the crimes continued, his reactions didn't become more intense. They became routine, repetitive, ritualized. He didn't see himself as evil. He often described his actions in clinical terms, almost as if he were observing someone else. When he was finally caught, he didn't fight. He confessed, calmly, even helpfully. There was no outburst, no denial. According to forensic psychologists, this kind of behavior is consistent with compartmentalization, a mental process where conflicting thoughts and actions are kept in separate boxes so the person can function without fully acknowledging the harm they've caused. Jeffrey Dahmer knew what he had done, but for years, he kept it in a mental room no one else could see. And when that room finally opened, the world was horrified. But he was strangely relieved. Jeffrey Dahmer's story is disturbing, not just because of what he did, but because of what was missed. The warning signs were there. The isolation, the emotional numbness, the fascination with control, the early detachment from others. He wasn't invisible, he was just overlooked. This raises a difficult but necessary question. How many other people are silently unraveling? Right now, mental health isn't always loud. It doesn't always look like screaming or crying. Sometimes it looks like silence, withdrawal, a flat voice, a blank stare. If someone in your life seems emotionally distant, if they stop expressing joy or connection or concern, it's not always a phase. Sometimes it's a sign. Empathy is our strongest defense. Early intervention matters. Teachers, parents, friends. We all play a role in recognizing emotional distress before it turns into emotional collapse. No one becomes broken overnight. It happens slowly, over years, and it can be stopped if someone notices. This doesn't mean we can predict or prevent every tragedy, but it does mean we can try. We can listen without judgment. We can ask harder questions. We can take mental health seriously before it becomes irreversible. Jeffrey Dahmer's path wasn't inevitable. It was the product of disconnection and of a world that looked away for too long. Jeffrey Dahmer's story isn't just about crime. It's about collapse. The slow collapse of empathy, of identity, of connection. He was not born a monster. He became one quietly, through years of loneliness, emotional suppression, and psychological neglect. And while the outcome of his story is deeply tragic, the deeper lesson is about recognition. We often ask, how could this have happened? But maybe the better question is, where were the chances to stop it? What if someone had asked more questions? What if someone had noticed the drinking at 14, or the obsession with control, or the emotional blankness? What if mental health support had been available and normalized? We can't undo the past, but we can learn from it. If this video made you think, share it, talk about it. Because the more we understand psychological decline, the better we can prevent it. And maybe that's the real legacy of stories like this, not fear, but awareness. Because sometimes the worst crimes don't begin with anger. They begin with silence, with pain no one sees, with needs no one meets. So the next time someone seems distant, don't look away. Ask, listen, care. You never know how much it might matter. If you found this video insightful, consider subscribing for more thoughtful explorations of the human mind. Leave a comment below. What warning signs do you think are most often missed? Thank you for watching.